All right, today we have another episode from the archives with one of my incredible guests. Enjoy. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast, a show about the incredible people dedicated to helping those who have experienced trauma. My name is Guy McPherson, and my mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to inspire each of us to help those around us. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson, and this is the podcast where we're interviewing master trauma therapists from all over the world to learn about what inspires them and the steps they've taken to become masters in their field. If you're a trauma therapist, if you're interested in trauma therapy, or if you're simply really passionate about helping other people, this is it. Today, I am so excited to introduce my guest, Linda Gantt. Linda, are you ready to go?
I am.
All right. Linda Gantt has a Master of Arts in Art Therapy and a doctorate in Interdisciplinary Studies. She's the owner and executive director of Intensive Trauma Therapy in Morgantown, West Virginia, an outpatient clinic for trauma-related disorders where art therapy is a primary means of treatment. Linda is also the co-developer, along with Carmello Tabone, of the Formal Elements Art Therapy Scale, an instrument designed for measuring diagnostic information in drawings. All right, Linda, so just a little bit about you. Share with us where you're calling from and perhaps a little bit of personal information, and then we'll get going.
All right. Well, I'm calling from West Virginia, from the northern part of West Virginia, where West Virginia University is. And I live in a beautiful area called Lake Woods, and this was a place that my late husband, Lieutenant, and I had found almost by accident, and we moved out here because Lou could fish out of his front yard. So that was a wonderful discovery that we had of Morgantown, and we lived here happily ever after. So Lou was quite a passionate person who was an amazing man of many, many interests. And you had contacted me shortly after he had died, and you didn't realize that that's what had happened. But I wanted to give you a sense of what his personality was like just by describing the picture we used for the program that we did for his memorial service. And it's one of him out on our lake, on his windsurfer, in his tuxedo, holding a glass of wine and a cigar in one hand as he guides the sail of the windsurfer.
Oh my gosh.
And this was taken when he wanted to show some college friends of mine what kind of man I had married.
Wow.
And so he came out of the house without a word to any of us as we were sitting there by the lake, and he hopped on the windsurfer, sailed across the lake, turned around and came back, and one of our friends snapped the picture as he started to alight on the dock. But that gives you some sense of what this man was like. He was a lot of fun, and he was a passionate person. He was especially interested in trauma. Mm-hmm. And people around West Virginia have been calling us Ma and Pa trauma because we were sort of a fixture in a number of trauma conferences that were sponsored by the university.
So just to frame this for our listeners, I reached out a while ago to Linda's husband, Lieutenant, to invite him to be on the podcast, and I guess, several weeks had passed, and then I got an email from you, Linda, and, in that email you informed me that actually Lou had passed away, pretty recently. So, and that was kind of it, and then I think after a couple of days, I kind of emailed you back and said, asked you if you'd like to be on. So I think that, gives us a little bit of background for our listeners, but let's kind of transition here with our first subject, Linda, which is the quote. This podcast really is about learning about you and what you've done, and what's inspired you. So share with our listeners a quote, if you will, a mantra, whatever, something that's kind of guided you in your journey.
All right. Well, it was a quote or a mantra that Lou and I had shared, and it's finish the story, because what we believed happens in trauma is that a person dissociates at the time of going into the biological freeze. And in that altered state that ensues, the memory of what is happening is very much garbled or fragmented or fractured. And as a result, when the person's come out of that traumatic event, it's very difficult to tell exactly what happened. I think a lot of therapists are frustrated at the fragmented nature of many trauma memories and don't know quite what to do about it. But we had the idea that you really did need to finish the story, and then you could deal with other things such as what these various events meant in the life of the individual. If you didn't finish the story, however, a person was prone to having flashbacks and intrusive and avoidant and arousal symptoms, all the things that we characterize as being part of PTSD.
So finish the story. Now, when did that become apparent for you? When did this idea of finishing the story become apparent for you?
Well, it was probably the most vividly apparent when Lou was working at the university doing a comparison of 3 different ways of getting the story. He used nitrous oxide with one group, laughing gas. And then with another group, he used sodium amytal, administered intravenously. And then with the third group, he used hypnosis. So the question was, of these people in these 3 different groups, which ones derived the greatest benefit from this means of accessing the material? And what he found was it really didn't matter about the method of obtaining the story. What mattered was that the story was actually finished, because those people who would go into an abreaction and who would get so bent out of shape by the details of the story and would want to stop recounting what had happened, those were the ones that who had the most difficulty. However, the ones who finished the story, even if it was difficult, but it nonetheless came to a point where the person could say, yes, I survived, then those people were the ones who had the greatest benefit. And so that was such a striking demonstration that you really had to get all of the details of the story in order for the person to feel that it was truly over.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, just so resonant with, a lot of our listeners, certainly, and how we as clinicians, along with our clients, get to that point of finishing the story, and the different ways that, we can go about doing that is another topic which I want to get to. Before we do, however, let's kind of take a step back here and share with us, Linda, really how you got into this field of trauma, how you became, in a sense, to be known along with Lou as Ma and Pa Trauma. People get into this field for a lot of different reasons. A lot of our listeners are at various stages with their engagement in trauma education and so forth. But share with us how you got into this field. What drew you into it?
Well, it seems like it was in the dark ages, because we're talking about my career spanning 40 years. Lou's career spanned 50 years. And when I began in my career, nobody talked about trauma. So we're talking about the early 1970s. And at that time, Lou was the chief of psychiatry at a general hospital in the Washington, D.C. area. And I was the first art therapist who was hired there. And so he and I started getting extremely interested in the subject of psychosis. And people who were in my art therapy groups were there because they couldn't go into the verbal groups. They couldn't talk. They were acutely psychotic, but they could do artwork. Sometimes the artwork was pretty rudimentary, but we were very interested in how the psychotic symptoms were expressed through the art. We also had a dance movement therapist and an occupational therapist, and so the three of us worked with these very difficult, essentially nonverbal patients. Well, nobody did anything, though, in terms of assessing for trauma at that time. The concern was if you asked people about any kind of trauma history, it would be opening a can of worms. And at that time, people were just thinking of trauma being something like sexual abuse. They weren't thinking about medical trauma, about combat trauma. And this was before the third edition of the DSM came out and had PTSD in it. And of course, your listeners to the trauma podcast, I'm sure, are quite familiar with the way that the veterans groups had lobbied the people who were working on the DSM to say, hey, wait a minute, we've got something that is a disorder that needs to be included in that Bible of psychiatry. Now, Lou had a private practice at this same time, and he had a lot of patients who were on lithium. He got an investigator's license in order to study the use of lithium, and he would periodically have to hospitalize some of the people in his private practice. And we saw together one case of a woman who had what was called at that time multiple personality disorder. And her artwork was an important key to what was going on with her. In fact, she mailed in at one point some artwork that she had done that was sort of it was kind of like a cryptogram or like a puzzle that Lou and I had to try to figure out. So we were very intrigued by the highly dissociative patients, but we didn't even have the capacity to be able to talk about dissociation because everybody was so focused on schizophrenia and bipolar disorder at that time. So when we moved to West Virginia in 1979, Lou took a job at a community mental health center as the medical director, and I went on and started working on my doctorate. But this freed us up to start looking at some of the trauma presentations that the American Psychiatric Association was having at that time. There weren't many of them that were being offered, but there were ones by Bennett Braun and Richard Cluft, and there wasn't any research to speak of. Most of these presentations were about some of the clinical aspects, lots of case studies and so forth. So we got very intrigued with those presentations, and then the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, ISTSS, and what is now called ISSTD, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, were just fledgling organizations. And boy, talk about passionate people. Those trauma therapists were really so excited to be able to get together with other clinicians and start comparing notes. And of course, those two organizations are fabulous places for people to go and get really the best of the best in the way of research and presentation and clinical advice. So
you share this story of kind of when you just started working out and you were using drawings and art therapy in a sense to work with individuals who had schizophrenia, and even trauma really wasn't talked about certainly at that time. You talked about it as if you spoke about it, you certainly be opening up a can of worms. And then what was the transition, Linda, that for you, where you said, this is something I'm interested in or passionate about or curious about? At what point did trauma become something that you wanted to pursue?
Oh, goodness. It was not so much a sudden thing as it was just a gradual kind of revelation, like everything that
Sure.
I read or heard about in these clinical conferences just got more and more intriguing. And Lou and I would talk about these things that we had seen or these patients we were treating, and it was just something that was so riveting. Now we had the idea that we would be able to write a grand theory of psychosis, and after we started going to these larger national meetings, we said, whoops, we better change direction because trauma is where it's at. Mm-hmm. So I think it was a kind of gradual sort of change, but a very significant one.
Sure. I completely understand that. I didn't mean to imply that it was just a light bulb moment, but all right. So Linda, let's move along here. We talked a little bit about what the process of you getting into this field. You started off with that quote, in a sense. Now, share with us kind of an early clinical error you made, something that happened maybe when you were just starting out, or maybe even recently, but how that impacted you and how it kind of informed the work you do.
Well, I think that we realized that the clinical errors were in not really paying enough attention to what the person was trying to tell us without having the words for it. So I think that the story or the information I'd given you about Lou's comparison of those three different groups, the nitrous oxide group and the sodium mannitol group and the hypnosis group, that there were mistakes made in the treatment of those individuals, and that had to be corrected. It's like doing a mop-up operation. When I can also think of one woman who came into the general hospital who was a lovely person who was just so nice to talk to when she wasn't highly dissociative, but she would get triggered, although I didn't know what that word was at the time. She would get into a childlike state, and there was nothing that I could do to get her back because I didn't know the principles of grounding. Nobody in our hospital talked about grounding. It wasn't a concept that I really learned until, I would say, until sometime in the mid-'80s. And now grounding is something I think every therapist needs to know in order to make certain that you don't put a person into a state that they're not going to be able to easily get in their car and drive home after a session.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, I appreciate you sharing that. And I guess now, as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, you started off by saying, finish the story. And I know at your facility, intensive trauma therapy, you guys do trainings and so forth. What is your process of working through that or towards finishing that story? Talk to us a little bit about that, Linda.
Well, we have a structure that we use at intensive trauma therapy that is built on the concept of the instinctual trauma response. Now, there have been a number of people like Peter Levine, Ellert Nienhuis, and Bob Scare who talk about the importance of the freeze. Mm-hmm. And what we had done was to kind of elaborate on the process of going into a trauma and giving people what essentially is the nonverbal truth of a traumatic event, regardless of the event, whether it's a medical trauma or a natural disaster or a fire or domestic violence or sexual abuse. It all those things follow essentially the same kind of pattern. So we tell people when they're doing their processing and drawing pictures of their trauma, that they start off with a before picture and then a startle picture, then the thwarted attempt to fight or flee, and then when that doesn't work, they go into a freeze, and then into the altered state of consciousness, and then into automatic obedience, and not in every trauma, but in those that involve another person. That's usually the case. And all through those different aspects of the instinctual trauma response, you have body sensations that later become the symptoms that are so troubling. It's not the words, but it's the bodily experience of what the person is going through that is really the key. And so many symptoms are things that seem kind of baffling, but when you put them in the context of what actually happened in the trauma, then you're going to recontextualize them and they cease to be symptoms. But anyway, I was explaining the different pictures that a person draws. So they're going in the sequence of what we know to be the usual trauma sequence, and then we get to self-repair, and then to an after picture. And so we have a series of pictures that can then be put onto the wall, pinned up on a very big bulletin board, and the therapist can represent the story back to the person using as many of the person's words as possible. And so this is something that a lot of therapists don't do, is to give this kind of feedback. The representation seems to be one of the most impactful aspects of our process of telling the story, because we tell it again in the representation, and it's clear then to the person that we heard what they had said, and also that the story is over with.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're speaking about these different stages or drawings that a client is going to be working on and working through. Obviously, each client is going to be different, but over the course of how many weeks would a process like this unfold, for example? I mean, would someone be working on one particular drawing or stage for several weeks or several months?
Oh, no. In fact, it wouldn't be that long. Now, we have our intensive work, which is a substitute for hospitalization. And that's where people come for a week or two and work every day, 7 hours of therapy. That's what makes our program what we think to be a unique one. We haven't found any other place that does quite as many hours of therapy as we do. But we train people to also use this process in a more traditional one time a week kind of delivery model. And so in that case, a person could do several of the drawings in 1 hour's session.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the former or previous guests I had on here, Gerald Vest, who works very closely and has for a long time with veterans. And he said something very similar. He said, the treatment that and he was talking specifically about veterans, but the treatment that these guys need is intense and it's constant. It's not just, this coming in once a week, and that ability to be with them for those many hours was just so therapeutic for them. So your program just sounds amazing, and I'm just really excited to share that with our listeners here up on the show notes page.
All right.
So,
well, let me also say about veterans, Lou did a lot of work with the Veterans Administration Hospital in Clarksburg, West Virginia. And so many of the techniques that we use were developed with the veterans in mind.
Ah, okay. Nice. So this brings us, Linda, to one of my favorite questions, which is why? Why? I really believe it's important. We know why we're doing something because I feel it just inspires us on our journey. So let me put that to you. Why do you keep doing this, day after day?
Because these are where the most exciting developments in mental health are. Mm-hmm. When you look at what we've learned of late, like, for instance, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACE study, we found out how maltreatment in childhood shortens a person's life by a decade or two, right? Well, doesn't this give us all an impetus to do something about it? And then when we think, wow, something can be done, that's really exciting.
Yeah.
In these long careers, we've been able to see that even though there have been some amazing medications that have come online, as far as trauma goes, those medications just take the edge off symptoms, but they don't cure the underlying problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's when the person is having so much dissociation or intrusive or avoidant symptoms that the past is weighing so heavily on the individual, then you've got to go back to what we started the interview with. You've got to finish the story, and then the person can move forward.
Mm-hmm. So, what I'm really curious about is the intensity of your program. And, you said you work 7 hours with these individuals. How do you start, for example? I'm just really curious about the process of, building rapport and so forth. Can you kind of give us a description of what that might look like?
Yes. Well, of course, our staff would have already talked to the person who was coming into the program, and it might have been, let's say, it's typical to have 2 telephone interviews before the person is ready to come in. Prior to those interviews, the person has already filled out 3 of our trauma assessments. When they arrive at the clinic, they'll fill out 3 more, and we're very big on doing outcome research. But on day 1, we say we're going to let you experience all of the processes we're going to use to process a trauma. And so from the time that we start with the guided imagery to the time we finish at the end of the day with the externalized dialogue, we will have given a person the sense of how you can take a trauma and put it into past history. And we start off by saying this is practice, but we use an event that people are not likely to remember, which would be either a baby in distress, which we say, this is practice. You can make up a story, but you'll just learn how the process goes. Or if you had a difficult birth, you can do that, because a lot of people have information if they've had a difficult birth. Or it might be something about the climate of the household in which the person grew up. But it's really pretty amazing after we've done the psychoeducational piece early in the morning, and then we've taken them through these practice sessions, that people say, oh, I see how this works. Mm-hmm. And I see that this is different from what I've done in therapy before, because we really get right down to what needs to be done.
Now, are you working with individuals as a team, or is it one-on-one, or both?
We're working as a team.
Okay. That sounds really exciting.
And the important thing is that any of the transference issues are generally transference to the clinic as a whole.
Okay. So Linda, you've been doing this for a while. You've talked about, the decades that your career has spanned. Many of our listeners are perhaps just beginning their trauma education. Some have been therapists for a while, but maybe don't think that they've worked with trauma individuals or individuals who've been suffering from trauma. What advice would you have for someone, a therapist, who's interested in kind of beginning to work with trauma clients or individuals who've suffered from trauma?
Well, I think that there are a couple of things that I would advise. One is go get Bessel van der Kolk's brand new book. I just got a copy of it recently, and I think he does a wonderful job synthesizing what has happened over his career with respect to people being able to understand that trauma is so pervasive and yet so treatable. And then I would say to the beginning therapist who might be somewhat timid is that they can get really good advanced training. You have to have specialized trauma training. You can't just rely on what you got in your graduate program, because if you finished your graduate education before 2000 or even 2010, the likelihood of having several courses devoted to trauma is pretty low. In fact, I've talked to a lot of people who come to us for training, and I'll say, how many of you had a single course in trauma? And many people would not raise their hands because they just didn't have that kind of information. But I tell you, the number of publications we have in the field now is so wonderful and exciting. They're fabulous books available. And I think that if the beginning therapist would attach themselves to a study group in their area, or if there isn't one, maybe they would put one together, get a couple of people for a peer supervision group who are interested in trauma. That's a fantastic way to be able to dip your toe into the water.
Sure. And that book you're referring to is The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk, which I'll have linked up in that. I would completely agree is a phenomenal book. So speaking of books, Linda, can you recommend two either trauma-related or not, which have really influenced the work that you do?
Okay. Well, van der Kolk's earlier book back in 1987 called Psychological Trauma, he talked about the one woman who was quite psychotic, who was a survivor of the Coconut Grove nightclub fire, and she would have an anniversary reaction every year and be floridly psychotic when she would see the flames leaping up the walls of the room that she was in. And it was from that information that let us know we were on the right track in working with really acutely psychotic people, that it was something that was trauma-based. And then, Bob Scare's book, The Body Bears the Burden, is wonderful because he comes from more of a medical perspective. And he also talks about pre-verbal trauma, which is a special interest. The artwork is so helpful for processing pre-verbal trauma. Freud said that his patients told him they could draw their dreams rather than talk about them. It's too bad Freud didn't go ahead and take them up on that suggestion.
So 2 books there, Bessel van der Kolk's Psychological Trauma, and Bob Scare's The Body Bears the Burden. You know, before we stop here, Linda, I just really want to ask you this question. I mean, you know, again, you have such a rich experience and you have a breadth of experience and knowledge. What do you think has shifted? And I know this is probably an impossible question, but what do you think has shifted for you from when you first started working with, you know, individuals who've been traumatized to now? I mean, is it just the way you approach someone? Is it your openness? Is it your ability to draw from the years of experience you have? Is it your willingness just to not have to think like you have to, you know, change something or fix something? Can you speak to that a little?
Well, I would say that what seems to have changed for me, Guy, is I've really developed the conviction that trauma is the most treatable of all the mental health disorders. Mm-hmm. And knowing that gives me a lot of passion, and it certainly informs my training that I give to other clinicians. I feel like it's really hard for us as a society to recognize how badly we treat other members of our society, especially our youngest members. But if we could accept that there are things we can do to prevent people from having such traumatic lives, and we could also see that we can treat the people who have had such histories, and that we can get some amazing progress, then I think that's really the most exciting thing. That
I was just going to say, I appreciate that. I mean, that conviction, having that conviction, but it also seems having that conviction born of the years of experience you have, and what, you know, the weight that carries with it for you in a treatment room or with the clients you work with. So thank you for sharing that. So Linda, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
I'll give you 2 email addresses. One would be for our general program. That would be info@traumatherapy.us, like United States. And my personal email at work, linda@traumatherapy.us.
Okay. So 2 emails, again, they'll be up on the show notes page. And your website, let me see here, intensive trauma therapy, that'll be linked up. You have, information on your training institute, publication, resources. Anything you want to share with us about the website?
Well, it's undergoing a revision.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
Okay, awesome. We'll link that up. Linda, I want to thank you so much, and really especially because of the context, you know, in which this took place. But you've been just so gracious, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experience.
It's been lovely talking to you, and I'll say the same thing that Garrison Keillor says: go and do good work.
All right, Linda.
And keep in touch.
Take care.
Okay.